Nope, it's not a typo. Here's the thing, I find that even people who love and enjoy the Beatles, which, let's face it, is more or less everybody, still sometimes don't really get just how good and important the Beatles actually were. Are they just a really good band? Are they just wrote lots of really good songs? Oh no, it goes much deeper than that. So here are 5 reasons why the Beatles are underrated. Number 1, John introduced the world to the British sense of humour. Now, if the British have a single defining characteristic, it is that we are, by some distance, the most sarcastic culture ever to emerge on the face of this planet. We are incapable of expressing ourselves without irony, we have a very low tolerance for anybody who takes themselves too seriously, and we have an almost pathological need to take the piss out of everything we see. Now, nobody exemplifies the British sense of humour like the Scouse, and nobody exemplifies the Scouse sense of humour like John Lennon. In particular, the Americans had just never seen anything like this. Those 60s Beatles press conferences in America are some of the funniest things you've ever seen. This is a time when even the bad boy pop stars called everybody sir and ma'am. So while it is an open question as to whether, say, Monty Python would even have happened if it hadn't been for the Beatles, I'm fairly sure they wouldn't have been quite such a big deal with the Americans if the Americans hadn't had the Beatles to practice on. Number 2, Paul is perhaps the best rock and roll songwriter ever. Now, for my money, one of the Beatles' few musical weaknesses was as a rock band. To me, they're always at their least convincing when they're trying to rock out. That sort of prototypical hard rock stuff they do in the last couple of albums. Stuff like, Revolution or Helter Skelter. But while the Beatles maybe weren't a particularly good rock band, they were a superb rock and roll band. From a songwriting point of view, rock and roll is actually quite a tricky genre to operate in. It's so basic, it's so limited. It's actually quite difficult to write a song that is in any way musically interesting but still works as rock and roll. And Paul in particular was, and indeed is, a genius rock and roll songwriter. Saw us standing there, possibly the best British rock and roll song of all time. Can't Buy Me Love, it's a straight rock and roll song with a couple of extra chords in the chorus. So while the Beatles weren't maybe that good at rock music, they were at rock and roll music. Number 3, George invented world music. If you've ever heard a bit of exotic instrumentation on a Western rock song, then thank George Harrison. All that kind of experimentation with West African and North African sounds that your Paul Simons and your Stings were getting up to in the 80s, it can all be traced directly back to George's fascination with Indian music in the late 60s. George was pretty much the first person to try and incorporate exotic and foreign musical idioms into the Western rock and roll form. If it hadn't been for George, rock music might still to this day consist just of 2 guitars, drums and bass. I know that would probably quite suit the NME readers among you. Number 4, Ringo is the single most underrated drummer of all time. I'm not even going to bother trotting out all the old Ringo jokes, you've heard them already. But there is a certain received wisdom among unenlightened people that Ringo was just this clueless chancer who blundered into a group that just happened to be in the process of becoming the greatest rock and roll band ever. It's very important to remember that Ringo was the only one of the 4 who was actually headhunted. John, Paul and George had all been in bands together since their school days. Ringo was the guy they went after and chose to be their drummer when it was time to make a serious push for the big leagues. And oh boy did he step up. If you need proof as to the fact that Ringo was a good drummer, he was the drummer in the band where one of the main songwriters was John Lennon, who had no concept of time signatures. John Lennon wrote everything 1 beat at a time. Have you ever tried actually counting along with the verse of Good Morning, Good Morning? For reference sake, it goes 2 bars of 3/4, 1 bar of 4/4, 2 bars of 3/4, 1 bar of 4/4, 1 bar of 2/4, 1 bar of 3/4, 1 bar of 4/4, 1 bar of 2/4, 2 bars of 3/4, 2 bars of 4/4. Or as it played out in John Lennon's head, 45 bars of 1/4. Trust me, Ringo was a good drummer. Number 5, they invented dance music in 1966. The last track of the 1966 album Revolver, Tomorrow Never Knows, is a dance track. Not just because of what it sounds like, it's basically the track that the Chemical Brothers have been trying to reproduce for their entire career, but because of the way it was put together. It was constructed, as dance tracks are, out of loops and samples, but this was 20 years before the technology for doing looping and sampling would be invented. So it was done analog. Actual loops of actual recorded tape with the sounds on them going round and round and round in Revox tape machines, and then being painstakingly assembled together into this incredible sound collage over this looped driving rhythm. It's a dance track. In 1966, the Beatles weren't just ahead of their time, they were decades and whole genres ahead of their time. So yes, there you go, 5 reasons why the Beatles are, if anything, underrated. I should do a whole show about this. I did do a whole show about this. Maybe I'll do it again one day.
This video was made possible by the supporters of my Patreon project, who help me make fun things while receiving great perks and rewards. If you enjoyed it, why not follow the link and join us?